from APM, American Public Media.
More than a century ago, a company called Calum helped Jacksonville become the winter film capital of the world, a reputation that lasted only a decade. Hear the fascinating true story on Bygone Jacks, Our Unsung History, a podcast from WJCT Public Media.
The North Florida TPO is committed to shaping our transportation future. We're focused on planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, connected community. Learn more at northfloridatpo.com. Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Up next, national and local news from NPR and the WJCT News team.
Good morning, I'm Ann Schindler. On today's First Coast Connect, at least 34 children sent to the notorious Dozier School for Boys ended up on Florida's death row. We discuss a new report examining whether the abuse they endured may have played a role. Then, preparing for disaster by training the community to help itself in the event of a weather crisis. And artists, poets, and even a Jacksonville City Councilman are queued up for a night of storytelling in the season finale of the Untold Stories series. You're welcome to join our conversation live on air at 904-549-2937. You can also email us at firstcoastconnect@wjct.org.
NPR News in Washington, I'm Nora Rahm. President Trump has wrapped up a trip to Scotland by opening a second golf course at his Aberdeen Golf Club. NPR's Franca Ordonez reports.
President Trump traveled to Aberdeen, Scotland with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and met with Scottish First Minister John Sweeney. He later appeared on the first tee of the new course, dressed in golf gear with a white glove.
We have a world that's got some conflict, but we've ironed out a lot of it. We're going to have a great and peaceful world, and on a much smaller scale, this will be a tremendously successful place, and a place where people can come and enjoy life.
Standing next to his sons and holding a large pair of scissors, Trump then cut a red ribbon stretched along the first tee before taking the first drive on the new course. Franco Ordonez, NPR News, Aberdeen, Scotland.
Some of the Venezuelan men deported from the U.S. to El Salvador are describing their stay in a maximum security prison. As Sergio Martinez Beltran reports, the men say they were beaten, sexually abused, and denied adequate food.
One of the men is 19-year-old Carlos Daniel Terán. He was sent to Secot in March as part of President Trump's mass deportation efforts. That was hell, says Terán. He says guards at Secot stomped on the men with their heavy boots and hit them with batons. He says one time they shot at them with rubber pellets. El Salvador's government did not respond to a request for comment. A spokesperson for the Department of Homeland Security called the allegations, quote, false sob stories. The Trump administration paid El Salvador $6 million to house the men. The White House said they were gang members, but many of them, including Terán, do not have a criminal record in the U.S. Sergio Martinez Beltran, NPR News.
Unprecedented levels of hunger in Gaza have prompted global outrage and joint Jewish and Palestinian protests. NPR's Emily Fang reports from Tel Aviv.
Hunger strikes from Tel Aviv in Israel to Ramallah in the West Bank are ongoing this week. Omar Asaf is one of the more than 24 Palestinian activists going hungry in Ramallah to raise awareness of starvation in Gaza. He told NPR producer Nuha Musleh that previously Palestinians did not do enough to show support for Gaza, in part because they were nervous of being detained or arrested. Sami Abu Shihada, a Palestinian citizen of Israel, is organizing another hunger strike in Tel Aviv.
We are doing this in order that we will not lose our humanity. We are doing part of this activity to ourselves, to our children, to our society.
He says he hopes through the hunger strikes that Israelis of all backgrounds keep their empathy for other human beings. Emily Fang, NPR News, Tel Aviv.
And you're listening to NPR News in Washington.
You're listening to WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. Good morning. I'm Stephen Ponson. It's now 9:04. Jacksonville Sheriff T.K. Waters hosts the next Sheriff's Town Hall this evening at 6. Tonight's meeting will be for residents in Police District 3, which covers Jacksonville's South Side and Mandarin neighborhood. The sheriff will be joined by staff and officers and will take questions from the audience. The meeting is at University Christian School on University Boulevard West. The next town hall meeting after tonight is for the Arlington community on Friday, August 8th. The Bowles School in Jacksonville will name its renovated baseball stadium along San Jose Boulevard after Hall of Famer and Atlanta Braves legend Larry Chipper Jones. Jones is a Bowles alumnus and was the lead contributor to the $3.7 million project. The school did not disclose how much Jones donated to the project. The renovated stadium will include an upper-level terrace with dual towers and a traditional architect design that pays homage to historic Bowles Hall. Construction is expected to wrap up before the start of the 2026 high school baseball season. It's going to be dangerously hot again today here in northeast Florida and southeast Georgia. An extreme heat warning is in place from noon until 7. With the heat index, it'll feel as if it's between 108 and 115 degrees, so you'll want to try and stay out of the sun as much as you can, drink plenty of water, and check in on your neighbors or relatives today. A front is moving into southeast Georgia, firing up storms, and then eventually moving into northeast Florida later on this afternoon and evening. Overnight, we're going to have lows in the mid to upper 70s.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include the estate of Joan B. Kroc, whose bequest serves as an enduring investment in the future of public radio and seeks to help NPR produce programming that meets the highest standards of public service in journalism and cultural expression.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health and North Florida TPO.
Good morning, I'm Ann Schindler, and this is First Coast Connect. Today, it's a youth prison so notorious, hundreds of former inmates are being paid by the state for their suffering. Others are being executed. We discuss a new report that examines the link between the abusive Dozier School for Boys and Florida's death row. Later in the program, a new Red Cross program helps neighbors help neighbors in crisis. But first, a recent investigation uncovered a stunning fact. At least 50 boys sent to Dozier and its equally troubled sister school, Okeechobee, ended up on Florida's death row. Another 19 were convicted of murder. In all, the men killed at least 114 people. Here to talk about the questions raised by the new report, I'm joined by Alan Chipperfield. He's an attorney with the Fourth Circuit Public Defender's Capital Division. Al, thanks for being here.
Sure enough.
We're also joined by Claudia Wright, former attorney with the American Civil Liberties Union and the National Prison Project, also lead attorney in a seminal class action lawsuit against the Dozier School. Good morning, Claudia.
Good morning.
So, Al, we're going to get deeper into the findings of this report, but if you just sort of start us off, why it might matter, either to a defendant or his attorney, if he'd been subject to the kind of abuse that was alleged to have happened at Dozier.
Well, in capital cases, the jury has to decide between a life sentence without parole or a death sentence. And in order to do that, they have to consider aggravating factors and mitigating circumstances. Aggravating factors are things that make the crime worse. Mitigating are things that would mitigate punishment or call for a life sentence rather than a death sentence. Childhood experiences, adolescent experiences are things that are important in determining blameworthiness or moral culpability because they affect a person's life and the decisions that he makes. And things like what has happened in Dozier affect adolescents and affect their brains. Developing brains. And so it's as important as PTSD that you would get from fighting in a war or intellectual disability that you're born with. It's a factor that the jury can consider in determining moral culpability for the crime that was committed.
And so in terms of presenting that evidence to a jury, you would, for instance, research the time that someone spent at a school like Dozier and dig into the kinds of experiences that they had and try to perhaps find other people that would have information about that to kind of verify it.
That's right. Yeah, and I mean, the family members too. Family members can, observe that a child who came home from Dozier is different, somehow different, just like people who come home from the war. Families notice that they're different. But in cases like that, you look for supervisors, people who worked at Dozier, people who were there at the same time as the client, what they experienced, which would be similar to what the client experienced.
Claudia, this school's no longer open, but before, throughout its more than a century of history, it had a lot of complaints over the years. You, though, brought this first class action lawsuit against Dozier and Okeechobee and McPherson, which was a third school that accepted girls. You actually had to kind of sneak in to the campus of Dozier in order to gain access, in order to build the record for this lawsuit. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got in there and what you saw?
Well, it started fresh out of law school. I went to the public defender's office here in Jacksonville, and about the same time that Al started there, but I spent almost my entire time there working in the juvenile division. And I had found a child hogtied at the detention center here in Jacksonville. And of course, I represented lots of kids who went to Dozier, so I heard all kinds of things about that. Well, in 1981, I was hired by the American Civil Liberties Union National Prison Project to come to work in Washington and do institutional litigation. I was hired to work on a big case in Oklahoma where we sued 6 training schools and orphanages there. But when I went to work there, I told my boss, if I do this Oklahoma case, you've got to let me go and do Florida because it's bad. So we worked through that, and in 81, I started to work on the Florida training school case. Well, part of that is you have to get in there and see. I mean, you've heard all the stories from the kids. You've heard all the stories from the parents. But you have to get in there and look at it to see whether you really have a case or not before you can file anything in court. So I was at a conference in Washington, and I met some people who said, you need to talk to this guy, Jack Levine. He's at the Florida Center for Children and Youth in Tallahassee, and he's been concerned about Dozier, and I bet he can help you get in there and take a look and see what's happening.
Because of credentials that he had to do that.
Yeah, well, he had been in there. He had been teaching some classes to kids out there. So I went to Tallahassee and met with Jack and the people at the Florida Center for Children and Youth, and he said, yeah, I can get you in there, but we can't tell them that you're from the ACLU or they will not let you in. And at that time, the Florida Center for Children and Youth was mainly supported by the Junior League. So we just played like I was a Junior League person who wanted to go and tour the facility. So that's what we did. And I went out there and we went in and we talked to some kids and we got to see the cottages and we got to see the adjustment unit. And we were about halfway through with our tour when they figured it out, and I don't know what exactly happened, but maybe one of the kids recognized me from the public defender's office, or somehow they found out I was not from the Junior League. I was from the ACLU, and so they yanked us out of there immediately, and we had to leave. But we had enough information then that we could go ahead and pursue the case.
And so what were you seeing of concern?
Well, first of all, it's horribly overcrowded. Now, when you go to places like this, sometimes they look really nice on the outside, rolling green hills and little brick cottages. But then you notice that there's a high, 12-foot fence with razor wire around it. And when you get in, kids are not in all the cottages because they don't have enough staff. So twice as many people as should be living in one cottage are in, so it's terribly overcrowded. no staff. The worst of it was they had an adjustment unit, which is a separate building with isolation cells. And in those days, there really were no rules. They could keep kids in there for days, weeks, even months. We found kids in isolation, especially at McPherson, which was the one with the little boys. And they often didn't realize they were doing anything wrong, apparently, because they had no qualms about showing us how they hogtied the kids, letting us go in there. They had kids chained to the beds, to pipes, to vents. So I think that was part of the worst of the real obvious things was the abuse, the extensive use of isolation, the chaining, hog tying, and at Dozier, they had what they called dog boys. And if a kid tried to run away, kids were getting out of there all the time, climbing that fence. And they had a whole group of guys called dog boys that would chase the kids down with dogs and then terrify the kids when they caught them.
So in the years that followed and in the investigation that followed, the work that you did, the chaining, the hog tying was part of the claim, but also beatings, brutal beatings carried out both by staff members and sometimes other inmates in these sort of staged fights that they would create, that staff members would make the boys engage in fights with each other, sometimes to discipline the kids, sometimes to kind of bet on the kids. There was also rampant sexual assault, often between older boys and younger boys, but also between staff members and the inmates there. And so the level of child abuse that was occurring there that you brought to the attention of authorities in this case really went way beyond what you were able to see that day you visited.
Oh, yeah. Well, after the first time, and then after we had an opportunity to visit and investigate McPherson and Okeechobee, we filed our case, and then we could go whenever we needed to go and take experts with us. And so we interviewed literally hundreds of kids. So we heard all about all those abuses. For purposes of the lawsuit, we really wanted to look at the overall situation as opposed to the individual cases of each child. The systemic problems that were there, because our goal was to get as many kids out of there as we possibly could. We were part of, back then, what was called the deinstitutionalization movement. And we wanted to get kids out of there as opposed to try to making it a nice prison.
Mm-hmm.
We wanted them at home and in community-based programs.
And not just because it was overcrowding, that was happening there, but because the levels of offenses that these kids were accused of really ran the gamut. And Al, I want to ask you about that in terms of your experience in defending anyone that had a juvenile offense at some point. I mean, the kids in these programs, not just at Dozier, but at Okeechobee, some were as young as 5. They went up to age 20. They were grouped together. Very often you had kids who had real serious criminal histories, of murder or sexual offenses mixed with kids who just had developmental disabilities. Sometimes you had kids who were runaways or who'd been caught smoking or who had were truants. And so the level of offense, it basically was kids they just didn't have a place for. Could be orphans.
Mm-hmm. One size fits all. I mean,
yeah.
That, and what has happened over the years, back in the 80s, the 90s, they didn't know that much about childhood trauma and how it impacted a person. And, for for several years, the work that I was doing, if you argued childhood trauma with a murder defendant who was 25 or more, it didn't mean anything to a jury. It wasn't persuasive. But now they know that childhood trauma affects people for their whole life, and it actually affects the brain, and that the human brain is still developing in adolescence and early adulthood until age 25 or so. And the last part to develop is the executive functioning of the brain, the prefrontal cortex that affects judgment and impulse control, decision making. And when it has an effect on that, it affects your behavior. It affects your reaction to other people, your interpretation of their intent, and makes people more prone to violence and impulsive reactions rather than thinking through, hey, how should I respond to this? So that's important in mitigation in capital cases.
And so you've, in some of these cases brought in experts, neuroscientists to speak about brain development. What have you learned about, kind of the physical or, material impacts that a traumatic experience can have? Kind of what's happening there?
Well, what happens is that if you suffer trauma, you go into a state of kind of sort of fight or flight. There's a chemical dump in your brain of a chemical called cortisol and other chemicals too, but it places you in a state of survival, high alertness. And when you suffer a lot of trauma, then you're in that state for longer periods of time. And it's toxicity. It becomes an overload so that it damages the circuitry in the brain. So that it's sort of, if you're punished or something, there's a threat to your life, you get this rush of adrenaline. Everybody feels that. But when you're in a trauma situation, you feel that more constantly. It doesn't go away. And that's what hurts the brain. Very much like going to war, where you're in that state of high alertness all the time. That's not good for your brain. And children or adolescents who go through trauma suffer the same thing. And that's something that they didn't know. For a long time, they thought the brain was mature when it had full volume, when it wasn't growing anymore.
And that is kind of in earlier adolescence, when it's fully grown, sort of?
Yeah, 16, 17, 18, the brain is the full volume. But that doesn't mean that the wiring is complete. And the last wiring to be complete is in the prefrontal lobe, where with the executive functioning part of the brain that makes people different than other animals.
If you're just joining us, we are talking to attorneys Al Chipperfield and Claudia Wright about a new investigation that found at least 50 men on Florida's death row attended one of 2 abusive youth prisons here as children. You can join the conversation if you have comments or questions at 904-549-2937. You can email us at firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. And you can also reach out on social media. We've got a call from Susan in Mandarin. Good morning, Susan. Go ahead.
Yes, I know y'all are talking about extreme trauma, and it's extremely sad. But I was wondering if you could also talk about the damage that is done for just hitting kids for punishment, because I've read that is also really bad as well.
Interesting. I mean, I do think that there's been research on that, just in terms of, impacts of, I guess anybody getting hit, there is a reaction, right? Whether you're a child or a grown-up, and there can be some, I would guess, some trauma perhaps created by that.
Sure. I think that, what we normally deal with is excessive punishment. Physical abuse, physical neglect, emotional abuse, emotional neglect. Those are called adverse childhood experiences. And adverse childhood experiences are forms of trauma that, if severe enough, and if you don't have any ameliorative factors or resiliency factors, then they can affect your brain and your behavior. Not always. Part of the research into this by the neurobiologist was to try and soothe the child. For example, a child gets a shot, and the shot is upsetting and it causes the brain to react. But if you're holding a child while they get a shot, rather than just putting them on a table, then it soothes the child. It's the same kind of thing with trauma. If you have a parent or an adult, a responsible adult, who can come in and soothe the child and kind of lay aside the trauma or somehow make it less bad, then it helps.
Claudia, when you were finding out this information, as you say, your goal was to try to make sure that there were fewer kids involved in this system in the first place, that were having to go to these kinds of youth detention facilities, and that conditions there improved. And you did force the state into making changes. I mean, one of the outcomes of the work that you did was a settlement, was a settlement agreement basically with the state, where they made certain concessions about reducing the population. I think one of the first things that happened was almost instantaneous after you filed your lawsuit, where they agreed to stop hog tying children, which is basically when they're shackled with their hands and their legs behind their back and sort of laying on their stomach, which is how you found that first, child that you came across here in Duval County.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, it's kind of hard to believe right now, but that was their policy back in those days. It was HRS then.
Department of
It was Department of Health and Rehabilitative Services back in the 80s, before it was split into with one part delinquency and one part foster care dependency. So what were we?
Just the hog tying
Right.
measure
That was their policy then. So the first thing we did once we got our case filed, and it's really interesting that they fought this all the way. The state, we had to go to court to get an injunction in the federal court to stop hog tying. So, I mean, you would think that would be something that a staff person would be punished for doing that to a child, but that was their policy in those days, and they were not hesitant to tell us that they could not run that facility if they couldn't hog tie the kids. But we went to court. We got a preliminary injunction right when we first started the lawsuit, and they did agree to restrict the use of shackles and restraints and to prohibit hog tying. Hog tying is where a child's placed on their stomach. Their hands are handcuffed behind their back. Their ankles are handcuffed. And the strap is tied between those and drawn up really tight so that their ankles and their wrists are together and they're lying on the floor.
It's astonishing that was a routine matter. But, when you talk about the state's resistance and their justification for these policies, I mean, one of the truths of Dozier is that nobody was ever punished for the behavior of the staff there. And, there have been, various articles written about, and I know that Ben Montgomery of the Tampa Bay Times did some extraordinary reporting on Dozier. I think it was a Pulitzer Prize finalist, his reporting about Dozier. And it's interesting, though, because, while the science of brain development, Al, was still kind of emerging, when he was writing back in 2009, and that was one of the articles that really kind of helped close the school down for good, he was talking about the people and the crimes that they'd gone on to commit, people who'd served at Dozier, and sort of their terrible offenses against society after they left. He mentioned people like Robert Cherry, who was on death row, has since been, I think he died on death row. I don't know if he was executed on death row or not, but at any rate, a number of people that, he brought up as, we've kind of known that this treatment can't be a great thing. But at some point it moved into the realm of kind of an evidence-based bit of mitigation.
Well, yeah, I think, people, just a common sense approach, without knowing the science, you sort of figure that if that's the way you treat a teenager, then that's the way they're going to treat others. I mean, we are what we see and what we learn from our environment, from our parents, and in that case from people at Dozier. But then the science caught up with that, and the neurobiologist discovered that it's actually affecting the brain, and it's permanent unless you get appropriate counseling. It affects the wiring in the brain, and especially that part of the brain that helps you make decisions and exercise good judgment.
And that's something that the U.S. Supreme Court has also recognized.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's like intellectual disability. You know, we don't execute people anymore who are intellectually disabled, and we don't execute juveniles because we recognize now, the science has shown that there is much less moral culpability for intellectually disabled people and juveniles because of the development of the brain.
So, one case that came out of Jacksonville recently, just a few weeks ago, a man, Michael Bell, was executed for murders in Jacksonville back in the 80s. Or actually, excuse me, back in the early 90s. But in the just shortly before he was committed those crimes, Michael Bell was a Dozier, and he suffered, as many kids there did, beatings. He was forced to engage in these fights. He was also sexually assaulted, according to his testimony. It did not seem to matter in his early defense, though, Al. And so it was the kind of thing that in later years, as the science was emerging, perhaps became a bigger deal, but it really wasn't part of his initial attorney's defense.
And that's what I understand. At least it wasn't developed as well, but that's because the science wasn't developed as well. And, it depends on the level of advocacy of the lawyers too. But as I said earlier, that argument that, he was deprived during his childhood and therefore should be treated less severely when he commits a crime as an adult, that argument wouldn't fly. There are a lot of people who thought, well, get over it. But the science has shown that you don't just get over it. Mm-hmm. And then, too, we recognize, I think maybe more today, that it was our state who put him in there. And we damaged him, and now we're going to execute him. And there's at least an argument that shouldn't be if we're partly responsible. You can never tie a murder to a particular experience, but you can look at the percentages and you can look at the science and figure, yeah, it probably had something to do with his later behavior.
And it is interesting because the state has not questioned its culpability in the damage that it caused. In fact, just last month, the state began sending out these $21,000 checks to hundreds of former Dozier inmates to compensate them for what they suffered, Claudia. And so, that's part of an appropriation that was approved by the governor and lawmakers in Tallahassee, recognizing that this school was, unduly damaging to these kids.
And my understanding is that those reparations were paid to the families of people whose children died out there and were found in that graveyard, because those reparations only went up to 1975. So they didn't affect any of the kids who were there during the period of our lawsuit. And I think it's important to point out, too, to remember how common this was. When we filed our lawsuit, we were the radicals who said you shouldn't hog-tie kids. It was accepted everywhere. And it was always amazing to me that once we uncovered all this, made it public, filed our case in court, Bob Graham was the governor and was our first lead defendant. Never visited the school, never made any comment about how cruel it was. I never knew a single prosecutor who put a child there to come out there and see what happened. I never knew a single judge who put a child there to come out there and see what was happening. It was okay. What was happening there, and people knew what was happening there.
I do want to say, I know that some of the reparations that went out were to living applicants. People, as you say, nobody past the mid 70s was eligible. And there were a lot of kids that died out there, some of them due to trauma of one kind or another. And we could talk about that. I want to take a call, though, first from Linda in Jacksonville Beach. Good morning, Linda. Go ahead.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for bringing this topic to light. I live in Jacksonville Beach, and when I lost my daughter to a drunk driver that hit her car, I took custody of my 9-year-old grandson. And one of the things growing up was my father was with the Boy Scouts. He donated some office space, a building to them. And so he was big into Boy Scouts, and I became a big advocate for them. And I was the leader for a trip that we took to Marianna, Florida. And that's near the Dozier School. The location I don't think is exact, but it's within the vicinity. And we drove in at twilight. And I have to tell you, as soon as I got on the road leading to the campsite, not in the park yet, but there was a big open field, and there was a church, a standalone church, and there were quite a few trees, and they were spaced apart, and I got a terrible feeling that something bad had happened there. And the next day, we took a tour of the underground caverns in the state park, and we had to enter by going down into this cavern.
Linda, I'm going to ask you just to kind of wrap it up, Linda, if you can, just briefly.
Yeah, I will. So anyway, at the end of the tour, that was given by these parkmen, they turned out the lights, and they said, the kids were freaking out, and I got this eerie feeling again that something in that area had happened very, very bad, and I felt like when I found out about the boys at the Dozier School, I thought, oh my God, they probably took them to those underground caverns.
Linda, thank you for your call. Appreciate that. The question of kind of what happened to the children there did become a matter that the state also undertook because there had been a burial ground that existed there on the campus, and they went and kind of used LIDAR and found that there were dozens more bodies than were marked at the gravesite. And there were, there is, I guess, a belief that those kids, some of them died either unintentionally or were murdered by the staff at that facility. But to Linda's point, the town itself, Marianna was, sort of defended this school for a long time. It was open for, over 100 years. A lot of people from that town worked at the facility. And in fact, they had a postcard that if you're watching our live stream, you can see it was, sort of an advertisement for Florida Industrial School for Boys and how, it looked sort of elegant and really refined and like probably a very nice reform school. The inside was not what you experienced like that.
Right. And it was one of the few sources of employment for people out there in that part of West Florida, and they hung on to it. But it was also interesting that when we would go out there, we got phone calls, and sometimes when we were at lunch, we would go into the town of Marianna at lunchtime and have lunch. And we had residents out there, people who lived in Marianna, tell us, you got to do something about the way they chase these kids down with these dogs and try to scare them and make them kiss the dogs and humiliate them. So not everybody in Marianna was crazy about what was happening out there. And a lot of people knew why those kids were running away from there.
the question of correlation versus causation when it comes to a report like this, looking at the numbers and how many kids ended up on death row, there's some people out that would just say, I mean, they maybe they just had all the right people at Dozier, right? They knew early that these were destined to be death row killers, and they got them early, and that's why they were at Dozier.
You could make that argument. In a capital case, ultimately, it's up to the jury how powerful they think that kind of evidence is. It certainly correlates to future dangerousness and future violence. Whether it causes it, you can't say. Just like you can't say with somebody who comes back from a war with PTSD, is that why they killed a guy on the road? Is that why they had road rage? The correlation is there, but a jury might decide, no, that's not powerful enough. I need better proof that it caused it, or else he's just a bad guy and killed somebody.
And I guess to the point you were making, that's kind of where family testimony can come in and play a role in terms of discussing if someone was changed, if somebody, presented one way and then after this terrible experience appeared to have changed somehow.
That improves your argument about causation for sure.
Yeah.
Well, and for a long time, that was one of the main theories behind delinquency was this bad seed idea, that if children are bad, they're bad when they're born and they can't be rehabilitated. And it's only in recent years that most of that's been discredited.
Yeah. Well, it is a interesting study. It's an interesting conversation. Claudia Wright, Alan Chipperfield, thank you so much for being here today. Really appreciate your insights.
Thank you.
Sure. My pleasure.
All right. Up next, community safety is a team effort in the face of intensifying weather events. Welcome back. Well, a new Red Cross training program helps neighbors help neighbors in crisis. Here to discuss the Shelter Hero program is Donna McNair, Disaster Workforce Engagement Manager for the American Red Cross of North Florida. Good morning, Donna.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. We're also joined by Marianna Gianni, the group's Community Disaster Program Manager. Good morning, Marianne.
Good morning, Ann.
So extreme weather takes a lot of forms, and, so do the disasters that can result. This year, we've seen hundreds of people, killed by tornadoes, floods, events, wildfires. And even here today, we're having this extreme weather event. It could be 113 degrees, feels like temperature outside. So we're all kind of living with the frequency of these events. And I would guess that spells greater need for community response. But can you kind of tell us what it is that you're seeing at the Red Cross and why it is that you're trying to get community involvement, to increase community involvement?
Yeah, so we're seeing less time between major disasters and more frequency of those disasters. So whether it's major hurricanes, wildfires, this extreme heat, our apartment fires, it's constant. We are in constant response to our communities. So that creates an even bigger need to have more community assistance locally rather than relying on bringing in people from the outside.
Yeah. And so the model that the Red Cross uses is kind of, partly to keep its cost down and to also assign the cost, the money that it has to people in need, is to help kind of spread that responsibility around. and this training program is sort of focused on that. Is that right?
Correct. So, our current campaign is called Shelter Heroes. The intention is to build more resilient communities and make sure that we're building response teams here in our local counties so that if something happens, whether it's something like a hurricane that we have notice of or no notice events where we need to open a shelter immediately, we have large pools of volunteers who are trained and qualified to help their neighbors.
And so, Marianne, what does that look like, practically speaking, when you're asking a community to sort of step up in advance and, be prepared to play a role?
Basically, we're asking people to support readiness and our preparedness, whether they're coming in for training virtually, in person, whether they're helping us spread the word about just hazardous preparedness in their communities, at churches, at different organizations, businesses, schools, camps. We are just trying to prepare our communities to respond and just build that resiliency.
Yeah. And so, what is the need? I mean, in the wake of something like it could just be an apartment fire, it could be flooding like we've seen here post storm. What are kind of the immediate needs, and how do you help volunteers train to respond to them?
The immediate needs generally that we come across when we're doing immediate response is that sheltering, just a safe place to be, a safe haven. Those facilities that support sheltering. We even have shelter agreements with different organizations, churches. We're always looking for no notice shelters because fires can happen at any time and take out, whole apartment buildings, displace multiple people at one time. So it's really great to have no notice shelters available. Having all those people trained to support those no notice shelters within the community is a really big need. And I do apologize. I kind of lost my train of thought there.
Oh, I mean, I think just in terms of not only what the need is, but how you train people to rise to that need, when it comes.
Oh, definitely. So we offer a lot of targeted training depending on the position that people would like to pursue. We have virtual, we have in person. We basically work around the clock. I know it says our doors are open from like 8:30 to 4:30, but we're generally always there.
Right.
We definitely do respond 24/7. But it's great because it's at people's convenience most of the time to train and to actually respond. Their availability is based on, whether they can or can't, and that's okay. We understand that people
Yeah.
have their own commitments, but it's beautiful when they're like, hey, I got 6 hours today. Let me be on call,
Yeah.
you know?
And so to be clear, while shelter is a need, these are agreements that you typically arrange in advance with organizations or some place that has a larger facility. You're not typically asking people to take in people who are displaced, but those people that you're training, you are giving them certain skill sets to know how to be helpful when a disaster strikes. And what is it that you are training them to do primarily?
Our Shelter Hero campaign actually offers a 1-day training that covers all of our required classes. That's going to develop their skills in client care. So, kind of that customer service piece of how to care for the clients in those shelters. We always say everyone is welcome. So, being able to have that good hello, good goodbye, that great kind of light in the time of a dark time for them that they could be experiencing. They could be scared or lost. But we teach our volunteers how to welcome them with open arms, and then all of our procedures. So, how to handle reception, how to handle registration, how to set up and organize the dormitory, and different situations that may come up in the shelter and how they can manage those as a team. They always have a supervisor as well. So, if a certain situation comes up, we have a team of people on shift. And through our classes in that day of training, we go through all of that, even some hands-on how to set up a cot, how to properly handle feeding.
Wow. And so, yeah, food is a big part of it. Shelter is a big part of it. And as you say, people coming in with some traumatic experiences needing compassion. So this next training event is Friday, August 15th. And that is at the Red Cross office on Riverside Avenue.
Correct.
It's at 9 a.m. And where can people sign up just briefly?
They can go to redcross.org/shelterheroesfl to register. They can also go to our Eventbrite link.
All right. Donna McNair, Marianna, Gianni, thanks so much for being here. We'll be right back.
I'm Scott Tong. Semicolons are being used less frequently these days. In fact, they've almost disappeared entirely.
Kurt Vonnegut said, don't use semicolons. All it does is show people that you went to college.
Semicolons, pretentious and unnecessary, or punctuation that deserves a revival. Next time, here and now.
Today at 1 on WJCT News 89.9.
On the next Fresh Air, comic and actor Mark Maron talks about panic, grief, his problematic cats, his expanding acting career, and why he's ending his popular podcast WTF, which he started in the early days of podcasting. Maron has a new HBO comedy special titled Panicked, and he's the subject of a new documentary. Join us.
Today at noon on WJCT News 89.9.
Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has appointed new members to the CDC's Vaccine Advisory Panel. Some of those members believe in vaccine conspiracy theories. A former CDC advisor says,
"We are living in a dangerous moment right now, and I think we're right on the precipice of something much worse."
That's on the next On Point.
Today at 11 on WJCT News 89.9.
Artificial intelligence, military readiness, protecting supply chains. Underneath so many of our most contentious political debates is China and how to compete with its rising influence in the world. But what does China want? Next time on 1A, we hear insights from the Aspen Ideas Festival, including how China's leaders think and how the country might want to change international politics in the future.
Today starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. Artists, poets, even a Jacksonville City Council member are queued up for a night of storytelling in the season finale of the Untold Stories series. Here to tell us about it is Barbara Colacello. She's the artistic director and host of Untold Stories. Good morning, Babs.
Good morning.
Great to have you here. We're also joined by Mark Cregan, artist, songwriter, and storyteller at this upcoming event. Good morning, Mark.
Thanks. Great to be here.
So, Mark, you're a bit of a known quantity around Jacksonville in the artistic community. For your work in visual mediums, for your musical work, how did you decide to take the stage in the storyteller event?
Well, Babs asked me.
Uh-huh.
I've attended a lot of her story slams at Babs Lab, and I've performed on stage as a musician there, but I've never had the courage to actually go up and tell a story. So when she challenged me to do this, I was like, okay, I guess this is the time.
So what did it take ultimately for you to decide that you were going to step onto the stage? Was it just being challenged, or was there something kind of also appealing to you, either about the theme of this production, route?
Yeah, I mean, I really didn't know what direction I would take. I looked up the definition of route. That kind of helped me, but usually when Babs asks me to do something, I tend to do it. And
she has an influence on people.
It's fun. I mean, it's great to work with her, and I always learn so much.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So this, as we said, the theme is root. Barbara, you're actually participating as a storyteller. I mean,
Right.
typically you're coaching, you're helping people get up there, tell their stories, find their best way to do it. But this time you're actually telling your own story. How has it been different for you?
Well, I'm loving it. It's crazy. Now I understand why storytellers tell me it's transformative. I've discovered a lot, made a lot of connections with right away. I mean, I had an idea because root, I think of aortic root, and mine was replaced. So that's the place I started. But I wow, it's been a journey and it's been great, and I'm excited to do it. Besides, this is the end of the fourth season, and been reflecting on that. I've coached about 100 people in Jacksonville.
Wow.
Uh,
That's a
uh,
lot of stories out there.
yeah, and in my head and in
Yeah.
my heart, you really get involved. You get connected to people in a different way.
Mark, one of the things that's part of your performance is the ukulele, a new song that you've written
Yeah.
on the ukulele. Well, you said that the dictionary kind of helped you focus a little bit. Can you just
Oh,
tell us
yes.
a little bit about what your root theme is built
Sure.
around?
Well, it touches on my childhood, and I tell some somewhat traumatic events in my childhood. Nothing like what your first story dealt with, but mostly it's about how I used my imagination to kind of cope with that, and how that's sort of been like the root of me becoming a creative person and writing songs and making art. So,
And is it difficult to kind of be revealing about something like that on a stage of, and before hundreds of people?
yeah, I mean, it's definitely stuff that I've dealt with personally. Now I'm in my 50s, so I'm okay talking about it. And I've written a lot of songs about my childhood and dealing with some of that. So I'm kind of used to that, but certainly in this format, telling a story on stage is very different.
In addition to Mark Cregan, Barbara, you've also got Taryn Warwood, who performs spoken
Love
words under
Reigns,
Love
yeah.
Reigns, right? You've got Jimmy Peluso, city council member, queued up to
Yeah.
do a
Yeah,
performance.
he's been great. He got really into it. It's finding the time, he'll say, I have from here, um, but he's been great. He's showing up, he's loving it, and he keeps making the remark like, I feel like I'm the barber shop quartet and everybody else is, Pink Floyd. Isn't it boring? I'm like, Jimmy, this is not boring. Okay, just tell your story.
That's so funny. That's a great comparison. You also have, for the first time, a guided interactive experimental meditation. That sounds
Oh
really
my gosh,
interesting.
yeah. Anthony Anorca, who is a bassoonist at the symphony for many years, such a talented electronic musician. And yeah, he does sound bowl healings and energy work. Um, so when he talked about root, of course, he goes to the root chakra. So he had this idea, and I love it. So we're ending the evening with him.
Oh, wow.
So I think the audience is really going to dig it.
Well, the final episode of this year's season of Untold Stories around the theme root is here at it's at the Florida Theater. You can get tickets at floridatheater.com. It's Thursday, July 31st at 7:30, and it's one not to be missed, especially with Barbara taking the stage.
Yeah, come on out.
All right. Mark Cregan, Barbara Colacello, thanks so much for being here today. I
Thank
appreciate
you.
it. Sure. And thank you for listening. That's our program. If you missed anything, you can catch our rebroadcast at 8 o'clock tonight or find our entire archive on your favorite podcast platform. Join us tomorrow when we talk to the writer and director of a new film centered on a small Florida town that you'll recognize, Atlantic Beach.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided by Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com. The North Florida TPO is dedicated to transportation planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, resilient, and connected region. More information available at northfloridatpo.com.
Listen to Anthology on 89.9 HD3 and let the music unlock your memories. All your favorite music from the 60s, 70s, and 80s are always on 89.9 HD3 Anthology.